I lost everything in a hurricane. I begged my son for shelter. He slammed the door in my face. No space. My wife won't let you ruin our Italian floors. Shivering in the storm, I used my umbrella to shield a scared dog. Suddenly, 3 limousines blocked the street. A little girl jumped out crying, "You saved Rocky." Her billionaire father saw us and did something that changed everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The rain hammered against what remained of my kitchen window with a violence I had never experienced in my 62 years. Hurricane Delilah had torn through our neighborhood like an angry beast, leaving behind a trail of destruction that made my modest 2-bedroom house look like a child's broken dollhouse. Water dripped steadily from the collapsed ceiling into the metal pot I had placed on what used to be my dining room table, each drop echoing through the hollow space that had once been filled with Martha's laughter. I stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom, clutching the blue umbrella Martha had bought me for our 25th wedding anniversary. The fabric was faded now, worn thin from years of use, but it was one of the few things that had survived the storm intact. Everything else, our photo albums, her collection of porcelain birds, the quilt her mother had made for our wedding, lay scattered across the floor in soggy, unrecognizable pieces. The insurance adjuster had left an hour ago, his clipboard full of numbers that spelled out my financial ruin. Total loss, he had said with the detached professionalism of someone who delivers devastating news for a living. The house was worth $300,000. But after the mortgage and deductibles, I would be lucky to see $50,000. My life savings of $42,000 had been in the local bank that was now underwater, literally. My monthly pension of $2,400 would barely cover rent somewhere decent, assuming I could find a landlord willing to take a chance on a recently homeless 62-year-old man. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. The screen cracked but still functional. My contacts list was painfully short. Walter, my son, was at the top. Below that were a few old work colleagues I hadn't spoken to in years, the dentist and Dr. Rodriguez, who had been treating my arthritis. Martha's name was still there too, even though she had been gone for 5 years now. I couldn't bring myself to delete it. My thumb hovered over Walter's name for several long minutes. We hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since his wife Sophia had made it clear that my presence at their housewarming party had been more obligation than invitation. But he was my son, my only family left in this world. Surely blood meant something when everything else had been washed away. The drive to Walter's neighborhood took 45 minutes through debris-littered streets. Palm Gardens estates sat on higher ground, protected by newer drainage systems and expensive flood barriers. The houses here were massive, cookie-cutter mansions that screamed success and prosperity. Walter's house was the largest on the block, a monument to his thriving dental practice. The Italian marble driveway gleamed even in the gray afternoon light, not a single leaf or branch marring its perfect surface. I parked my battered Honda Civic behind his BMW and Sophia's Mercedes, feeling suddenly self-conscious about my water-stained clothes and muddy boots. My reflection in the side mirror showed a man who looked every bit as broken as I felt. Gray hair plastered to my skull, lines of exhaustion carved deep around my eyes, shoulders slumped with the weight of loss. The front door was solid mahogany with an ornate brass knocker that probably cost more than my monthly pension. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. What would I say? How do you ask your own son for help when you haven't been welcome in his life for years? Before I could change my mind, the door swung open. Sophia stood there in her pristine white yoga outfit, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. Her expression shifted from mild curiosity to barely concealed annoyance when she saw me standing on her doorstep. "Lawrence," she said, my name sounding like a curse word in her perfectly modulated voice, "what are you doing here?" "I need to speak with Walter," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's been an emergency." She looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled appearance with obvious distaste. "He's in his study, but make it quick. We're expecting guests for dinner." The interior of their house was exactly what I had expected. all clean lines and expensive finishes, everything white and silver and cold. The living room furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, beautiful but untouchable. Even the air smelled expensive, like vanilla candles and furniture polish. I found Walter in his study, hunched over his laptop in a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's cars. He had inherited Martha's dark hair but my stubborn jawline, though success had softened his features in a way that made him look younger than his 34 years. He looked up when I entered, his expression cycling through surprise, irritation, and resignation. "Dad," he said, closing his laptop with a sharp snap, "Sophia said there was an emergency." "The house is gone," I said simply. There was no gentle way to deliver the news. "Hurricane Delilah destroyed everything. The insurance won't cover enough to start over." Walter leaned back in his chair, processing this information with the same clinical detachment he probably used when delivering bad news to his patients. "That's terrible, Dad. Really. But what do you expect me to do about it?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I was hoping maybe I could stay here for a while, just until I figure something out. Sophia appeared in the doorway as if she had been listening the entire time, which she probably had. Her face was set in hard lines that made her look older than her 31 years. "Absolutely not," she said before Walter could respond. "We just had these floors imported from Italy. They cost $40,000. I'm not having them ruined." "I would be careful," I said, hating how desperate I sounded. "I just need a place to sleep for a few nights." Walter stood up slowly, and for a moment I thought he might defend me. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out at his perfect lawn. "Sophia's right, Dad. This house isn't really set up for guests, and with my practice expanding, we need our space." "I'm your father," I said, the words scraping against my throat. "I raised you. I worked 2 jobs to put you through dental school. I never asked you for anything." Sophia laughed, a cold sound that filled the room like ice water. "You never asked for anything. What about all those times you guilted Walter into paying for your car repairs? Or when you needed money for Martha's medical bills?" "That was different," I whispered. "Martha was dying." "And now you're just looking for a handout," Sophia continued, her voice rising. "We worked hard for what we have. We don't owe you anything just because you failed to plan properly for retirement." Walter finally turned around, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Maybe you could find a senior living facility. Something affordable." "With what money?" I asked. Everything I had was in that house. Sophia moved to stand beside her husband, presenting a united front against the broken old man in their doorway. "That sounds like a personal problem," she said. "We have our own lives to think about." I looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for any trace of the boy I had raised. The boy who used to climb into my lap when he had nightmares, who had cried when his goldfish died, who had hugged me so tight at his high school graduation that I thought my ribs might crack. But that boy was gone, replaced by this stranger who valued Italian marble more than his own father's welfare. "Please," I said one last time, all my pride crumbling away. "I have nowhere else to go." Walter's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something that might have been guilt. But Sophia's hand on his arm seemed to steel his resolve. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, already moving toward the door. "But the answer is no. You'll have to figure something else out." They escorted me to the front door like I was an unwelcome salesman. Sophia was already on her phone, probably calling her friends to complain about the disruption to their perfect evening. Walter stood in the doorway, his face carefully blank as I walked back to my car. "Dad," he called out when I was halfway down the driveway. I turned, hope flaring in my chest, like a struck match. "Try the Salvation Army," he said. "They might have a shelter bed available." Then he closed the door, and I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a finality that echoed in my chest like a death knell. I stood there for several minutes, rain beginning to fall again, soaking through my jacket to my skin. The golden light streaming from their windows made their perfect house look like a beacon of warmth and safety, everything I had lost and would never have again. As I drove away from Palm Gardens Estates, I caught one last glimpse of my son's house in the rearview mirror. Walter was standing at his study window watching me leave. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the distance, and I saw something in his expression that might have been regret. But then Sophia appeared beside him, pulling him away from the window, and the moment was gone. The rain was getting heavier now, and I had nowhere to go. The rain had turned into a relentless downpour by the time I found myself parked under the massive oak tree on Meridian Street, 3 blocks away from Walter's neighborhood. The ancient tree's canopy provided minimal protection, but it was better than sitting completely exposed in an empty parking lot somewhere. I had been driving aimlessly for an hour, passing hotels I couldn't afford and apartment complexes that required first and last month's rent up front. Every option felt like another door slamming in my face. I turned off the engine and listened to the rain drumming against the roof of my Honda. The car smelled like Martha's old perfume, a scent that had somehow survived 5 years in the upholstery. Sometimes I still caught traces of it when I made sharp turns or hit the brakes too hard. Tonight it was both comforting and heartbreaking, a reminder of everything I had lost in the span of a single day. My phone had been buzzing intermittently with automated messages from insurance companies and disaster relief agencies, but I ignored them all. What was the point? Every conversation would end the same way, with forms to fill out, waiting periods to endure, and ultimately, the crushing realization that I was truly on my own for the first time in my adult life. I pulled Martha's old umbrella from the passenger seat and tested the mechanism. The metal was corroded in places and the fabric had several small holes, but it still opened and closed properly. She had bought it at a street fair in Charleston during our honeymoon, insisting that we would need it for our adventures together. "A good umbrella is like a good marriage," she had said with that mischievous smile I fell in love with. "It protects you from life's storms and makes you feel less alone in the world." The memory made my chest tight with grief that felt as fresh as the day she died. Martha would have known what to do in this situation. She would have made phone calls, found resources, somehow turned this disaster into an opportunity for a new beginning. But Martha was gone, and I was just a broken old man sitting in a broken old car, watching the rain wash away the last remnants of my dignity. That's when I heard the whimpering. At first I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again. A soft, desperate sound coming from somewhere near the base of the oak tree. I squinted through the rain-streaked windshield and saw a flash of movement in the shadows. Something small and dark was huddled against the massive trunk, trembling in the downpour. Without thinking, I grabbed the umbrella and stepped out into the storm. The rain immediately soaked through my jacket, sending cold rivers down my back, but I barely noticed. 20 feet away, pressed against the gnarled roots of the oak tree, was a small dog, maybe a terrier mix, shaking violently from cold and fear. His fur was matted and soaked, and his dark eyes held the same lost expression I had seen in my own reflection an hour earlier. "Hey there, boy," I said softly, approaching slowly. The dog lifted his head, ears perked but wary. A faded red collar around his neck suggested he belonged to someone, but there was no owner in sight. Just like me, he had been abandoned to weather the storm alone. I opened Martha's umbrella and crouched down beside him, angling it to provide shelter for both of us. The dog flinched initially, but then seemed to realize I meant no harm. Gradually, he stopped shaking and pressed closer to me, seeking warmth and comfort from a fellow refugee. "You're in the same boat as me, aren't you?" I whispered, gently stroking his wet fur. "Nobody wants us tonight." We sat there together under the inadequate protection of Martha's old umbrella, 2 lost souls sharing what little comfort we could offer each other. The dog's breathing gradually slowed, and I felt some of the tension leave my own shoulders. There was something profoundly calming about providing comfort to another living being, even in the midst of my own crisis. The wind picked up, sending sheets of rain sideways under our makeshift shelter. I adjusted the umbrella, trying to keep the worst of it off my small companion. My knees were aching from crouching and my clothes were completely soaked, but I didn't move. This dog needed me, and right now that felt more important than my own discomfort. "What's your name, boy?" I asked, checking his collar for tags. There was a small brass nameplate that read Rocky in elegant script, along with a phone number. No address, just a local number that probably belonged to a family who was as worried about him as I wish someone was about me. Rocky looked up at me with those intelligent brown eyes, and I could swear he understood every word. Dogs have a way of reading human emotions that most people never master. He could probably sense my despair, my loneliness, my desperate need for connection with another living soul. "Well, Rocky," I said, "looks like we're both having the worst night of our lives." As if in response to my words, Rocky shifted closer and rested his small head against my leg. The simple gesture of trust and affection nearly broke me. When was the last time another living being had sought comfort from me? When was the last time I had been needed, valued, wanted? The rain continued to pound down around us, but under our small circle of shared protection, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Martha's death, a sense of purpose. This little dog needed me right now, and I needed him just as much. We were keeping each other safe from the storm, and that mattered. That's when the headlights appeared. At first, they were just distant points of light cutting through the rain-darkened street. I assumed it was another car looking for shelter from the storm, maybe someone else displaced by the hurricane. But as the lights grew closer, I realized there weren't just one or two vehicles. There were three large, dark cars moving in perfect formation down Meridian Street. Rocky's ears perked up, and he lifted his head from my leg, suddenly alert. His tail began to wag tentatively, as if he recognized something I couldn't see yet. The three vehicles slowed as they approached our tree, their headlights illuminating us like actors on a stage. They were limousines, sleek, expensive vehicles that seemed completely out of place on this storm-battered residential street. The lead car was the longest, a stretch limousine that probably cost more than my house had been worth. Behind it were two slightly smaller but equally imposing vehicles, their tinted windows reflecting our huddled forms like dark mirrors. The convoy came to a complete stop directly in front of us, engines purring quietly despite the chaos of the storm around them. For a moment, nothing happened. We sat there frozen, an old man and a lost dog sharing an umbrella while three mysterious limousines blocked the entire street. Then the back door of the lead vehicle burst open, and a small figure came running through the rain toward us. It was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair streaming behind her as she splashed through puddles in her designer boots. "Rocky!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the wind and rain like a bell. "Rocky, you're safe!" The dog exploded into motion, wriggling out from under the umbrella and launching himself toward the girl. They collided in a tangle of wet fur and squealing laughter, both of them falling to their knees in the muddy grass. Rocky covered her face with desperate kisses while she hugged him so tight I thought she might squeeze the breath out of him. "I thought you were gone forever," she sobbed into his wet fur. "I thought the storm took you away." Behind her, 2 men in expensive suits emerged from the limousines, seemingly unbothered by the rain that was soaking their tailored clothing. One was clearly a bodyguard or driver, but the other, a tall man, with graying temples and intelligent eyes, had the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The little girl looked up from Rocky and saw me still crouched under the umbrella, now completely alone but still holding it open out of habit. Her eyes were bright with tears of relief and gratitude. "You saved him," she said simply. "You saved Rocky." The tall man's gaze shifted from his daughter to me, and I saw something change in his expression. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by surprise, then something deeper that I couldn't quite read. "Emma," he said quietly, "come here, sweetheart." But the little girl, Emma, was already running toward me, Rocky bounding along beside her. Before I could react, she threw her small arms around my neck, umbrella and all, hugging me with the fierce intensity that only children possess. "Thank you," she whispered against my wet jacket. "Thank you for taking care of him." Over her shoulder, I met her father's eyes. He was still staring at me with that strange expression of recognition, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him for years. "Sir," he called out over the storm, "might I have a word with you?" The inside of Marcus Rothwell's limousine was like stepping into another world. Soft leather seats that probably cost more than my monthly pension, climate control that had already begun drying my soaked clothes, and the kind of silence that only extreme wealth could buy. Emma sat between her father and me. Rocky curled contentedly in her lap as if the last few hours of terror had been nothing more than an unpleasant dream. Marcus had insisted I come with them, despite my protests that I was fine where I was. His driver, a professional-looking man named Thomas, had taken charge of my Honda with quiet efficiency, promising it would be safely delivered wherever I needed it. Everything had happened so quickly that I felt like I was caught in someone else's life, watching events unfold from a distance. "You're shivering," Emma observed, studying my face with the matter-of-fact concern that children sometimes possess. "Daddy, he needs dry clothes." Marcus nodded, pressing a button that connected him to the driver. "Thomas, please have Maria prepare the guest suite and find some appropriate clothing for our friend here, something warm." I started to object, to explain that I couldn't accept such generosity from strangers, but Marcus held up a hand. "Please," he said, his voice carrying an authority that wasn't harsh, but was clearly accustomed to being obeyed. "Let us help you. You've done something extraordinary tonight, and I'd like the chance to properly thank you." The mansion, that served as their destination, was exactly what I would have expected from a man who traveled in a convoy of limousines. It sat on at least 5 acres of manicured grounds, protected by subtle but sophisticated security systems. The main house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that somehow managed to look both imposing and welcoming. Maria, the housekeeper Marcus had mentioned, was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who took one look at my bedraggled state and immediately began fussing over me like a worried mother. Within 20 minutes, I found myself showered, dry, and dressed in clothes that fit surprisingly well, khakis and a sweater that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined. When I emerged from the guest suite, I found Marcus waiting in what appeared to be a library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls filled with leather-bound volumes that looked both expensive and well-read. A fire crackled in an enormous stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs that were probably older than I was. "Feel better?" Marcus asked, gesturing to one of 2 leather chairs positioned near the fire. A tray with coffee and sandwiches sat on the table between them, sending up steam that smelled like heaven to my empty stomach. "Much," I admitted, settling into the chair with a grateful sigh. "Though I have to say, this is all a bit overwhelming. I was just trying to keep a scared dog dry." Marcus poured coffee from an elegant silver pot, adding cream without asking my preference. Somehow he got it exactly right. "Emma is everything to me," he said quietly. When she told me Rocky was missing in the storm, I mobilized every resource at my disposal to find him. Security teams, search crews, even a helicopter when the weather permitted. But none of that mattered in the end. What mattered was one kind man willing to share his umbrella with a frightened animal. I took a sip of the coffee. It was extraordinary. Probably some exotic blend that cost more per pound than I spent on groceries in a month. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Marcus said firmly, his eyes meeting mine across the table. "They really wouldn't have. Most people would have driven past, maybe felt bad about it, but they wouldn't have stopped. They certainly wouldn't have sat in a storm for hours protecting a stranger's pet." There was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. He was studying my face with an intensity that went beyond gratitude, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him for a long time. "Have we met before?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "You keep looking at me like you recognize me from somewhere." Marcus set down his coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. When he looked up at me again, his expression had changed completely. The polite gratitude was still there, but underneath it was something deeper, a mixture of disbelief, recognition, and what looked like guilt. "Lawrence Patterson," he said quietly. "Consulting engineer, retired from Morrison & Associates in 2018. Widower, lost your wife Martha 5 years ago to cancer. One son, Walter, who's a dentist in Palm Gardens. My blood went cold. How do you know all that? Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. Because I've been looking for you for 15 years. I hired 3 different private investigation firms over the past decade, but Lawrence Patterson is apparently a more common name than I realized, and you never made yourself easy to find. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why have you been looking for me? Marcus stood up and walked to one of the bookshelves, pulling out a thick folder that looked like it had been handled many times. He returned to his chair and opened it carefully, revealing newspaper clippings, printed emails, and what appeared to be financial documents. Rothwell Development Corporation, he said, showing me a business newspaper article from 2008. That's my company. 15 years ago, we were 3 months away from bankruptcy. The housing market had collapsed, our biggest project was hemorrhaging money, and every bank in the state had refused to extend our credit lines. I vaguely remembered the neche, but couldn't place it in any specific context. 2008 felt like a lifetime ago. Martha had still been healthy then, Walter had just finished dental school, and I was still working full-time as a consulting engineer. I was desperate, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a confessional quality. My father had built Rothwell Development from nothing, and I was about to lose everything he'd worked for. I was 30 years old, arrogant, and completely out of my depth. That's when someone recommended I talk to you. The memory came flooding back in pieces. A young man in an expensive suit sitting in my cramped office at Morrison & Associates. He'd been almost frantic with worry, spreading blueprints across my desk and talking rapidly about cost overruns and design flaws that were threatening to destroy his family's legacy. The Riverside Commons project, I said slowly. You were building that luxury housing development, but the foundation work was all wrong. The soil studies were inadequate, and the drainage system wouldn't hold up to a heavy rain season. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with relief that I remembered. You spent 3 days going over every aspect of that project. You found 17 major problems that my engineers had missed, and you designed solutions for all of them. More than that, you restructured the entire timeline and showed me how to cut costs without compromising quality. It was just consulting work, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew there had been something different about that job. Marcus Rothwell had reminded me of Walter at that age, talented but inexperienced, drowning in responsibilities he wasn't quite ready for. You saved my company, Marcus said simply. But when I tried to pay you, you said you were too busy to take on a project that size. You recommended another firm, helped me transition the work to them, and then you disappeared. I sent you check after check, but you returned them all. You said you were just pointing me in the right direction. I remembered now. Marcus had tried to pay me nearly $50,000 for 3 days of work, but it had felt wrong to take that much money for what amounted to basic problem solving. The company I'd recommended had needed the business more than I did, and I'd been satisfied knowing that a young man wouldn't lose his father's legacy because of fixable mistakes. The project was completed 6 months ahead of schedule and 20% under budget, Marcus continued. Riverside Commons became the template for every development we've built since. The company went from near bankruptcy to becoming one of the largest residential developers in the Southeast. All because you took pity on a desperate kid and gave him 3 days of your time. Marcus opened another section of the folder, revealing financial statements and corporate valuations. Rothwell Development is now worth approximately $200 million. Last year alone, we completed projects valued at over $500 million. We employ nearly 3,000 people across 6 states. All of that started with the foundation you helped me save 15 years ago. I stared at the numbers on the page, trying to process what he was telling me. That's incredible, Marcus. I'm genuinely happy that things worked out so well for you. You don't understand, Marcus said, leaning forward in his chair. I owe you everything. Not just the money, though I've calculated the compound value of what you refuse to accept, and it's substantial. I owe you my entire life, my daughter's future, the livelihoods of everyone who works for my company. You saved us all, and then you vanished before I could properly thank you. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. I found myself thinking about the bitter irony of the situation. Here was a man whose life I had apparently changed with a few days of work, while my own son had turned me away in my hour of greatest need. The universe had a cruel sense of humor sometimes. "Marcus," I said carefully, "I appreciate what you're saying, but that was a long time ago. I was just doing my job." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You went far beyond doing your job, and now fate has brought you back into my life, under circumstances that I can only describe as miraculous. You lost everything in the storm, didn't you?" The question hit like a physical blow. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Then let me help you," Marcus said, "not as charity, but as payment for a debt that's 15 years overdue." Emma appeared in the doorway at that moment, Rocky trotting along beside her. She had changed into pajamas decorated with cartoon dogs, and her dark hair was still damp from her bath. "Daddy," she said, climbing onto the arm of his chair, "is the nice man going to stay with us?" Marcus looked at me over his daughter's head, his expression hopeful but careful not to pressure. "That depends," he said. "Would you like him to stay with us, Emma?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Rocky likes him, and Rocky is a very good judge of character." As if to prove her point, Rocky wandered over to my chair and rested his head on my knee, looking up at me with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see straight into my soul. Marcus cleared his throat gently. "Lawrence, I have a proposition for you. But first I need to ask you something important. Do you still remember how to build things?" I stared at Marcus across the coffee table, his question hanging in the air between us like a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. Do I still remember how to build things? The honest answer was complicated. My hands still knew the feel of blueprints. My mind still automatically calculated load-bearing requirements when I looked at structures. But it had been 5 years since I'd worked on anything more complex than fixing Martha's garden fence. "I'm 62 years old," I said finally. "My hands shake sometimes when I'm tired, and I need reading glasses to see fine print. The construction industry has changed a lot since I retired." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, but I could see in his eyes that my age wasn't a concern for him. "Emma, sweetheart," he said gently, "why don't you take Rocky upstairs and get ready for bed? Lawrence and I need to talk about some grown-up things." Emma slipped off the arm of his chair and scooped Rocky into her arms. As she headed toward the door, she paused and looked back at me with those serious dark eyes that seemed far too wise for her 8 years. "You're sad," she observed with the blunt honesty that only children possess. "But Daddy makes sad people feel better. He fixed Mrs. Henderson when her husband died, and he fixed Mr. Garcia when his restaurant burned down. He'll fix you too." After she left, Marcus poured fresh coffee for both of us, giving me time to compose myself. Emma's innocent words had hit closer to home than I cared to admit. I was sad. Deeply, fundamentally sad in a way that went far beyond losing my house in the storm. I had been carrying this weight of loneliness and disappointment for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to hope for something better. "She lost her mother 2 years ago," Marcus said quietly, settling back into his chair. "Cancer, same as your Martha. Emma has a gift for recognizing other people who understand loss." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "Losing a spouse is terrible, but losing a mother at that age—" "It nearly destroyed both of us," Marcus admitted. "I threw myself into work, trying to outrun the grief while Emma withdrew into herself. We were both drowning in our own ways until I realized that healing doesn't happen in isolation. We needed to help other people in order to help ourselves." He reached for the folder again and pulled out a set of architectural drawings that made my breath catch. They were preliminary sketches for a residential complex, but unlike anything I'd seen before. The buildings were designed to look like homes rather than institutional housing, with covered walkways connecting family-style units around central courtyards filled with gardens and play areas. "This is what I want to build," Marcus said, spreading the drawings across the coffee table. A housing complex specifically designed for families who've lost everything in natural disasters. Hurricane victims, wildfire survivors, people displaced by floods or tornadoes. Not temporary shelters or government housing projects, but real homes where families can rebuild their lives with dignity. I studied the drawings more carefully, my engineer's mind automatically analyzing the design elements. The architecture was sound but ambitious, incorporating features that would be expensive to implement. Solar panels, rainwater collection systems, community gardens, even what appeared to be a small school and medical clinic. This would cost millions to build, I said, looking up at him. The infrastructure alone would require permits and environmental studies that could take years to approve. Marcus smiled, the first truly relaxed expression I'd seen from him all evening. Money isn't the problem. I've already set aside $5 million for the project, and I have investors willing to contribute another $3 million if the design meets their standards. The permits are being fast-tracked through a contact at the state level. What I don't have is someone with the experience to oversee the construction and ensure it's done right. You need a project manager, I said slowly, beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. I need you, Marcus said simply. I've seen your work, Lawrence. I know what you can do when you're passionate about a project. This isn't just about building houses. It's about creating a community where people can heal and start over. It's about giving families hope when they've lost everything else. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands, trying to process what he was offering me. This was the kind of project I would have jumped at 20 years ago, the kind of meaningful work that could make a real difference in people's lives. But 20 years ago, I had been younger, stronger, more confident in my abilities. Marcus, I said carefully, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I think you're overestimating my capabilities. I haven't managed a project this large since the early 2000s. The technology has changed, the regulations are different, and frankly, I'm not sure I have the energy for something this demanding. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense but not pressuring. What if I told you that you wouldn't be doing it alone? I've already assembled a team of the best architects and engineers money can buy. You wouldn't be designing from scratch. You'd be refining existing plans and coordinating with specialists who know all the new technologies and regulations. Your job would be to ensure that everything comes together properly, that the vision doesn't get lost in the details. He pulled out another set of papers, these ones showing organizational charts and salary structures. The position pays $500,000 annually, plus a completion bonus of $200,000 when the project is finished. Full health benefits, housing allowance, and a company car. The timeline is flexible. If you need time off for any reason, we work around your schedule, not the other way around. The numbers were staggering. More money than I'd made in any single year of my entire career, more than enough to rebuild my life and secure my retirement. But more important than the financial security was the chance to work on something that mattered, something that could help people who were facing the same desperation I'd experienced just hours earlier. Why me? I asked. You could hire any project manager in the country for that kind of money, someone younger with more recent experience. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he chose his words carefully. Because you understand what it feels like to lose everything. You know what it's like to feel discarded, forgotten, abandoned by the people who should care about you most. The families who will live in these homes need someone who's been where they are, someone who won't just see them as another construction project. His words hit me like a physical blow, cutting straight through all my self-doubt and defensive barriers. He was right, of course. I did understand what those families would be going through, not just the practical challenges of losing their homes, but the deeper emotional trauma of having their entire sense of security ripped away. There's something else, Marcus continued, something I need to tell you about why this project matters so much to me personally. He walked to his desk and returned with a framed photograph that I hadn't noticed before. It showed a younger version of Marcus, standing next to an older man who shared his strong jaw and intelligent eyes. They were both wearing hard hats and standing in front of what looked like a construction site. My father, Robert Rothwell, Marcus explained. He started the company with nothing but a pickup truck and a willingness to work 18-hour days. When I was Emma's age, we lost our house in a flood. Dad was just getting started in the construction business, and we had no insurance, no savings, nothing. We lived in a FEMA trailer for 8 months while Dad worked every job he could find to save enough money for a down payment on another house. Marcus traced his finger along the edge of the photograph, his expression distant with memory. I remember the shame of it, the way other kids at school would whisper about the family living in the trailer park. Dad never let it break him, but I could see what it cost him, how it wore away at his confidence and his sense of self-worth. He swore that when he made enough money, he'd find a way to help other families avoid that humiliation. But he died before he could make it happen, I guessed. Marcus nodded. Heart attack at 57, just as the company was really starting to succeed. For years I told myself I'd eventually get around to fulfilling his dream, but there was always another project, another deadline, another reason to postpone it. Then, Catherine got sick, and I realized how quickly everything you think is permanent can disappear. He set the photograph down and looked directly at me. I don't want to wait any longer, Lawrence. I want to build something that would make my father proud, something that would help families like ours was when I was a kid. But I can't do it without someone who understands what those families are going through, someone who's been tested by life and come through it with their compassion intact. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of rain still pattering against the windows. I thought about everything that had happened to me in the past 24 hours, losing my home, being rejected by my own son, sitting in the rain with a frightened dog while my entire world fell apart. Then I thought about all the other people who were probably going through the same thing right now, families torn apart by the storm with nowhere to turn and no one to help them. I need time to think about it, I said finally. Marcus nodded, standing up and gathering the papers from the coffee table. Of course, this is a big decision, and you've been through a lot today. Why don't you stay here tonight, get some rest, and we can talk more tomorrow? As he headed toward the door, he paused and looked back at me. Lawrence, can I ask you something personal? Sure. When you were sitting under that tree with Rocky tonight, what were you thinking about? I considered the question carefully, remembering those long minutes when the rain was soaking through my clothes and I had nowhere to go except back to my car. I was thinking that maybe Walter was right. Maybe I really was just a burden, someone who had outlived his usefulness. I was wondering if this was how it would end for me. Alone, forgotten, taking up space in a world that didn't need me anymore. Marcus's expression grew sad, but there was steel underneath it. Your son is wrong, Lawrence. Dead wrong. You're not a burden, and you're certainly not useless. Tonight, you proved that when you chose to help a scared animal instead of wallowing in your own problems. That's not the action of a man who's outlived his purpose. That's the action of someone who still has important work to do. After he left, I sat, alone in the library for a long time, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. Through the window, I could see that the storm was finally beginning to pass, the rain slowing to a gentle drizzle and the wind no longer howling through the trees. For the first time in years, I found myself imagining a future that didn't revolve around waiting for the end. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I did still have important work to do. Maybe there were still people who needed what I had to offer. But accepting his proposal would mean admitting that my old life was truly over, that there was no going back to the familiar patterns of retirement and quiet resignation. It would mean choosing hope over safety, possibility over predictability. And after tonight, after seeing what choosing safety had cost me, I was beginning to think that might be exactly what I needed to do. 3 weeks had passed since I'd accepted Marcus's offer, and the transformation in my life felt like something out of a dream. I woke up each morning in the guest suite that Marcus had insisted I keep using until I found my own place, though I was beginning to suspect he had no intention of letting me leave anytime soon. Emma had taken to knocking on my door every morning at 7 sharp, Rocky at her heels, announcing that breakfast was ready and asking if I wanted to help her feed the fish in the courtyard pond. The work was everything Marcus had promised and more. The housing project, officially named Haven Village, was progressing ahead of schedule, and I found myself energized in ways I hadn't felt since before Martha's illness. My team of architects and engineers was brilliant, eager to learn from my experience while teaching me about new technologies and sustainable building practices. Every morning, I drove to the construction site in the BMW that Marcus had insisted was a company necessity, and every evening I returned to the mansion feeling like I had accomplished something meaningful. But the most remarkable change was in how I saw myself. The constant ache of loneliness that had plagued me since Martha's death was fading, replaced by a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. Emma had adopted me as a surrogate grandfather, seeking my opinion on everything from homework problems to whether Rocky preferred chicken or beef treats. Marcus treated me like the valuable partner I was, consulting me on decisions far beyond the scope of Haven Village and making it clear that my opinion mattered. I was reviewing soil compaction reports in my temporary office when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I'd deleted from my contacts but still remembered by heart. Walter. I stared at the screen for several rings, debating whether to answer. We hadn't spoken since the night he'd turned me away, and I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever conversation might follow. Finally, curiosity won over caution. "Hello, Walter." "Dad." His voice was different somehow, hesitant, almost nervous, not the cold indifference I remembered from our last encounter. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Your phone kept going straight to voicemail." "I've been busy," I said simply, not bothering to explain that I'd been screening his calls. "What do you need?" There was a pause that stretched long enough to make me wonder if the call had dropped. When Walter spoke again, there was something in his tone that I couldn't quite identify. Desperation, maybe, or fear. "Dad, I need to see you. There are things I need to say, things I should have said that night. Can we meet somewhere?" I leaned back in my chair, watching through the window as construction workers poured the foundation for what would become the community center. "I don't think that's necessary, Walter. You made your feelings quite clear." "Please," he said, and the word came out cracked, almost broken. "Just one conversation. There's a coffee shop called Meridian Cafe on 5th Street. Can you meet me there at 6 tonight?" Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. Maybe it was the unexpected vulnerability in his voice, or maybe I simply needed to close this chapter of my life properly before moving forward. Either way, 2 hours later I was sitting in a corner booth at Meridian Cafe, sipping coffee that couldn't compare to what Marcus's housekeeper served, waiting for a son who had turned his back on me when I needed him most. Walter arrived 10 minutes late, and I barely recognized him. The confident, successful dentist I remembered had been replaced by someone who looked haggard and uncertain. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. He slid into the booth across from me, fidgeting with his car keys like a nervous teenager. "Thanks for coming, Dad. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I said honestly. "What do you want, Walter?" He flinched at my direct tone, but pressed on. "I want to apologize. What happened that night, the way Sophia and I treated you, it was inexcusable. You're my father, and you came to us when you needed help, and we failed you completely." The words sounded rehearsed, like something he'd practiced in the mirror. I studied his face, looking for genuine remorse, but seeing mostly anxiety and calculation. "Apology noted," I said. "Is that all?" Walter's composure cracked slightly. "Dad, please don't be like this. I know we messed up, but we're family. Families forgive each other." "Are we family?" I asked quietly. "Because the last time I checked, families don't slam doors in each other's faces during emergencies." Walter ran a hand through his hair, leaving it even more disheveled than before. "Look, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Sophia, she's been having a hard time lately. The practice is struggling, we've got loans to pay off, and she's been under a lot of pressure. She wasn't thinking clearly that night." "And what's your excuse?" I asked. Walter's face reddened. "I should have stood up to her. I should have done the right thing regardless of what she wanted. You raised me better than that." I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch between us. Walter was squirming in his seat now, clearly uncomfortable with my lack of response. "The thing is," I said finally, "I've had 3 weeks to think about what happened that night. And you know what I realized? It wasn't just Sophia talking. Those were your words too, Walter. Your choices. You looked me in the eye and told me to try the Salvation Army." Walter's shoulders sagged. "I was scared, Dad. We really are having financial problems, and I thought you were just going to be another burden we couldn't afford." "A burden?" I repeated softly. "Your father, who worked 2 jobs to put you through school, who never asked you for anything until the night I lost everything. A burden." "I didn't mean it like that," Walter said desperately. Things have been so complicated lately, and I wasn't thinking straight." I leaned forward, studying his face carefully. There was something he wasn't telling me, some reason for this sudden urgency to reconcile. "Walter, how did you find out where I was staying?" His eyes darted away from mine. I I called around, asked some people if they'd seen you." "What people?" Walter's hands were shaking now, and he clasped them together on the table to try to hide it. "Dad, the important thing is that we found you, and now we can work things out. Sophia wants to apologize too. She feels terrible about what happened." "I'm sure she does," I said dryly. "Tell me, Walter, what exactly brought on this sudden change of heart? 3 weeks ago, you were concerned about your Italian marble floors. What's different now?" Walter's face went pale, and I knew I'd hit something important. He glanced around the coffee shop as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned closer to me across the table. "Dad," he whispered, "I heard about your new job." There it was. The real reason for this meeting, for his sudden remorse and desperate need to reconcile. Someone had told him about my work with Marcus, about the salary and the opportunities that came with it. "What exactly did you hear?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Walter swallowed hard. "That you're working for Rothwell Development, that you're making serious money, living in some mansion, driving a BMW. Dad, why didn't you tell me you had connections like that? We could have helped each other." The naked greed in his voice was almost breathtaking. Here was my son, the man I had raised and sacrificed for, openly admitting that his interest in reconciliation was purely financial. "Helped each other how?" I asked. Walter's eyes lit up, apparently mistaking my question for interest. "Well, my practice could use some investment capital. And with your new connections, maybe you could put in a good word for me with some of Rothwell's wealthy clients. Sophia's been researching cosmetic procedures that rich people pay cash for." I sat back in my seat, feeling something cold and final settle in my chest. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. 3 weeks ago, when I had nothing, you turned me away because I was a burden. Now that you think I have money and connections, you want to be family again." Walter had the grace to look embarrassed, but he didn't deny it. "Dad, I know how this sounds, but—" "It sounds exactly like what it is," I interrupted. "You don't want your father back, Walter. You want my bank account." "That's not fair," Walter protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I do want you back. We all do. Sophia's already started planning Sunday dinners, and she wants to redecorate the guest room so you'll be comfortable when you visit." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The same woman who had worried about her precious floors was now planning to welcome me into her home. The same guest room that didn't exist 3 weeks ago was suddenly being prepared for my comfort. "Tell me something, Walter," I said. "If I lost this job tomorrow, if I went back to being the broken old man who showed up at your door during the storm, would you still want to have Sunday dinners?" Walter opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The silence told me everything I needed to know. "I thought so," I said, standing up and reaching for my wallet. Walter grabbed my wrist across the table. "Dad, wait. Please don't leave like this. Give me a chance to make this right." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then met his eyes. "You had your chance, Walter. You had your chance to be the man I raised you to be, and you chose Sophia's marble floors instead." I pulled my arm free and dropped a $10 bill on the table for my coffee. "If you ever need emergency dental work, I'll make sure Marcus knows someone who can help you. Professional courtesy only." As I walked toward the door, Walter called out desperately, "Dad, what about family? What about forgiveness?" I paused at the door and looked back at him one last time. "You're right about forgiveness, Walter. I do forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't mean trust, and it doesn't mean letting you hurt me again." The autumn air felt crisp and clean after the stuffiness of the coffee shop. As I walked to my BMW, I felt lighter somehow, as if a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Walter's true nature had been revealed, not just to me, but to himself, and there was a strange relief in no longer having to pretend otherwise. My phone buzzed with a text message as I was starting the car. It was from Emma. "Rocky wants to know if you'll help him practice his tricks before dinner. He learned how to roll over." I smiled, feeling warmth spread through my chest. This was what real family felt like, not obligation or manipulation or conditional love based on what I could provide, but simple affection, freely given and received. I typed back, "Tell Rocky I'll be right there." As I drove away from Meridian Cafe, I caught a glimpse of Walter in my rearview mirror. He was still sitting in the booth, staring at his phone with an expression of disbelief, probably trying to figure out how his calculated attempt at reconciliation had gone so wrong. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel hurt or betrayed or abandoned. I just felt free. Free from the weight of trying to earn love that was never really there, free from the responsibility of maintaining a relationship that had never been genuine on his side. Walter had made his choice 3 weeks ago when he slammed the door in my face. Everything that happened after that was just consequence. 9 months later, I stood at the entrance to Haven Village, watching as the first families began moving into their new homes. The late spring sunshine cast everything in golden light, making the freshly painted houses look warm and welcoming against the backdrop of mature oak trees that we'd carefully preserved during construction. Children's laughter echoed across the central courtyard, where Emma and Rocky were teaching a group of kids how to play fetch properly. The ribbon-cutting ceremony had been scheduled for 10 in the morning, but families had been arriving since dawn, eager to see the place that would become their new beginning. I recognized the expressions on their faces, hope mixed with disbelief, the cautious joy of people who had learned not to trust good fortune too quickly. It was the same expression I'd seen in my own mirror 9 months ago when Marcus had first offered me this chance. "Nervous?" Marcus asked, appearing at my elbow with 2 cups of coffee from the catering station his assistant had set up near the community center. "Excited," I corrected, accepting the coffee gratefully. I never imagined it would turn out this beautiful. And it was beautiful. The architects had outdone themselves, creating homes that looked nothing like institutional housing or government projects. Each building was designed to accommodate 4 families, but the units felt like individual houses with private entrances, small gardens, and covered porches where children could play safely. The community center housed a daycare, a small medical clinic, and meeting rooms for job training and counseling services. Solar panels on every roof would keep utility costs minimal, and the rainwater collection system would maintain the gardens even during dry spells. But the most remarkable feature was something that couldn't be seen in the architectural drawings, the sense of hope that seemed to permeate every corner of the development. These families weren't just getting housing, they were getting the chance to rebuild their lives with dignity and support from people who understood what they'd been through. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event coordinator called out through her microphone, "if we could gather near the main entrance, we're ready to begin the ceremony." A crowd of about 200 people had assembled for the opening. Local officials, members of the media, representatives from the disaster relief organizations who had helped identify families for the project, and of course, the 32 families who would be calling Haven Village home. I spotted several faces I recognized from the construction process, workers who had volunteered to stay late when weather threatened to delay the timeline, suppliers who had donated materials when they learned about the project's mission. Marcus took the microphone first, thanking the various organizations and individuals who had made Haven Village possible. His speech was gracious and professional, but I could hear the emotion underneath his polished words. This project meant as much to him as it did to me, perhaps more. He was fulfilling a promise to his father while honoring his late wife's memory of compassion. But most importantly, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, I want to thank the man without whom none of this would have been possible. Lawrence Patterson isn't just the project manager for Haven Village. He's the heart and soul of everything we've accomplished here. He understood from the beginning that we weren't just building houses, we were building hope. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and genuine. I found myself thinking about how different this felt from any recognition I'd received during my corporate career. Those awards and commendations had been about profit margins and efficiency ratings. This was about something that actually mattered. When Marcus handed me the microphone, I looked out at the assembled crowd and saw faces that told stories I recognized. Maria Santos, whose family had lost everything in a wildfire 2 years ago. The Williams family, whose home had been destroyed by a tornado that swept through their small town in Alabama. The Johnsons, refugees from Hurricane Patricia, who had been living in a FEMA trailer with their 3 young children for 18 months. 9 months ago, I began, my voice surprisingly steady. I thought my life was over. I had lost my home, my savings, everything I thought defined who I was. I felt like a burden, a leftover from a life that no longer had any purpose. I caught sight of Emma in the crowd, grinning up at me with Rocky in her arms, and felt my chest tighten with affection. What I've learned over these past months is that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what really matters. It's not about what you own or what you've accumulated over the years. It's about what you can build, what you can give, how you can help other people find their way home. I gestured toward the buildings behind me, their windows gleaming in the morning sun. Haven Village isn't just my project, or Marcus's project. It belongs to everyone who lives here, everyone who helped build it, everyone who believes that families deserve a second chance when life knocks them down. This is what home really looks like. Not a building, but a community of people who take care of each other. The ribbon cutting itself was ceremonial, but the symbolism felt powerful as the red ribbon fell away and the first families walked through the entrance to their new lives. I followed the crowd as families found their assigned homes, watching children race through hallways that would echo with their laughter for years to come, seeing parents finally able to unpack belongings they'd been carrying from one temporary shelter to another. The celebration continued into the afternoon with tours of the facilities, demonstrations of the sustainable technology systems, and a barbecue picnic in the central courtyard. I found myself moving from group to group, answering questions about the construction process, but mostly just listening as families shared their stories of loss and resilience. Mr. Patterson? A voice behind me made me turn. A teenage girl, maybe 16 or 17, was standing with an older woman who had the same dark hair and intelligent eyes. "This is my daughter Carmen," the woman said. "She wanted to thank you personally." Carmen stepped forward, suddenly shy but determined. "My mom told me you lost your house in the hurricane too. I just wanted you to know that having a real home again, it means everything. My little brother has his own room for the first time in 2 years. My mom doesn't cry herself to sleep anymore because she's worried about where we're going to live." The simple honesty of her words hit me harder than any professional recognition ever could. This was why Martha's old umbrella had led me to that oak tree on the worst night of my life. This was what all the blueprints and construction schedules and budget meetings had been building toward. Moments like this when hope became reality. As the afternoon wound down and families began settling into their new homes, I found myself sitting on a bench in the courtyard with Marcus and Emma. Rocky was sprawled across my lap, exhausted from a day of meeting new friends and accepting treats from dozens of admirers. "So," Marcus said, "any regrets about taking the job?" I thought about the question seriously. 9 months ago, I had been a broken man with nowhere to go and no one who cared whether I lived or died. Tonight, I would go home to a house I'd finally purchased with my salary from Rothwell Development. A modest place just 10 minutes from Haven Village where I could keep an eye on the community we'd built. My calendar was full of meetings about the next phase of construction. Marcus had already secured funding for 3 more Haven villages in different parts of the state. More importantly, I had Emma, who had claimed me as her honorary grandfather and filled my life with the kind of joy I thought I'd lost forever when Martha died. I had Marcus, who had become not just an employer but a true friend and partner in meaningful work. I had the families of Haven Village, who treated me like a hero even though I was just doing what felt right. "No regrets," I said finally, "but I do have one confession to make." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "I never sent your BMW back to the company fleet. I've been making payments on it for the past 6 months, and yesterday the title transfer went through. I figure I've earned the right to keep it." Marcus laughed, a sound of genuine delight. "You know, I was wondering when you were going to mention that. My accountant asked me about it months ago." Emma giggled and hugged my arm. "Does this mean you're staying forever and ever?" "Forever and ever," I confirmed, kissing the top of her head. As the sun began to set over Haven Village, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of Martha's favorite sunset, I felt a peace that I hadn't experienced since before she got sick. The pain of losing her would always be with me, just as the disappointment of Walter's betrayal would always be a scar on my heart. But those wounds no longer defined me. I was Lawrence Patterson, project manager for Rothwell Development and honorary grandfather to Emma Rothwell. I was the man who helped families rebuild their lives after disaster struck. I was part of a community that measured success not in profit margins, but in children's laughter and parents' relief and the simple dignity of having a safe place to call home. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my stomach tightened, expecting to see Walter's name on the screen. Instead, it was from Maria Santos. "Mr. Patterson, Carlos took his first steps today in our new living room. Thank you for giving us a place to watch our baby grow up." I showed the message to Marcus and Emma, both of whom beamed with the pride of shared accomplishment. This was what family really looked like. Not the obligation of blood relatives who only showed interest when they needed something, but the chosen bonds of people who genuinely cared about each other's welfare. As we walked toward our cars in the gathering twilight, Emma skipped along beside me, chattering about the families she'd met and the games she wanted to organize for the kids who would be starting at the village school in the fall. Rocky trotted along at her heels, his tail wagging with the confidence of a dog who knew he was loved and would never be abandoned again. "Lawrence," Marcus said as we reached our vehicles, "I've been thinking about the next project. What would you say to a Haven village specifically designed for elderly people who've been displaced by disasters, people who might not have family to help them, who need both housing and community support?" I thought about all the people my age who were facing the same isolation and desperation I'd felt 9 months ago. How many Lawrence Pattersons were out there right now believing they were burdens instead of valuable human beings with something important to contribute? "I'd say that sounds like exactly the kind of project Martha would have wanted me to work on," I said. "When do we start?" As I drove home to my small but comfortable house, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at me was still 62 years old, still carried the lines of loss and disappointment that life had carved into his features. But there was something else there now, something that had been missing for far too long. Hope, purpose, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring meaningful work and people who valued my presence in their lives. I was finally home.